Now, the theory of the consumer, as I mentioned, had been developed around ordinary, everyday decisions, apples, newspapers. And this is actually a pretty large proportion of what we buy, goods and services, right? We don't really register that. But if you ever look at your credit card bills, look at how much is grocery, look at how much is coffee, look at how much is Amazon purchases. And it's interesting that a pretty substantial amount of our purchasing is in this range. But one of the most controversial applications of this theory of utility is to input markets. Now, I can see that I am using this idea, should I spend my money on apples or should I spend it on oranges, depending on my preferences, marginal utility of apple to price of apples versus marginal utility of orange versus price of orange, right? I can see that. One of the questions is this how people make decisions to supply labor? So, here is your two goods. One is labor, and the other economists often call leisure. You can work, or you cannot work. So we're going to pause here and ask a really serious question. Who imagines that when you are not earning a wage, you're just hanging out having leisure with your friends, watching TV, eating chips? As compared to the reality, which is for most people, when they are not in the labor market, they're caring for children, they're cleaning their homes, they're doing laundry, they're taking care of all the things that go into making homes. So the first thing we want to just really pause and remember is under this word leisure is essentially a complete erasure of the unpaid labor, mostly of women, in the household, and in particular childcare, right? So the idea that the choice is between working and just like fooling around as compared to can I go get a job or do I have to take care of the family is reflects what feminists often call positionality, that your theory reflects your own experience. And if this theory was developed by men in the 18th century in England who were elite and didn't actually in those days do things like household work and childcare, then you can see why that theory has deep gaps when it comes to today's world, where we're beginning to understand that, the world that Marshall lived in and so on is not our world, right? Where we're beginning to understand what goes there. Well, let's stick with this for now. So the argument is there's only so many hours in a day. Right? You can take all of those hours and spend it working, or you can spend it on leisure, or if you want to say that the value of leisure is the opportunity cost of wage, or is the cost of getting household services from outside purchasing childcare or whatever. Right? So the way you would start thinking of this is that marginal utility of labor, and usually people don't like to work, so sometimes that's a negative, called a marginal disutility of labor, divided by the price of labor, which is the wage, must equal the pleasure you get on the margin from leisure, and the price of leisure would be the opportunity cost, which is the wage, or it could be the cost of acquiring these services from the market. Right? This is very interesting, because this suggests that people make a decision to supply more labor based on the wage, or less labor based on the wage, and that there may be situations where people say, I'd rather just hang out with my friends and I don't want to work, right? So this is a very interesting theory because you want to ask yourself whether this actually explains why people are not working. Is it just that they don't want a job even though jobs are there and they're just hanging out at home and doing nothing? Or is it that that's not what's going on, that childcare is too expensive, or there are not enough jobs, or other kinds of things like that, right? So when it comes to input markets, we can definitely use this theory. That is where people's political approaches start really showing up in economics, where there are folks who will argue that there's no such thing as unemployment, and the real reason that you have all these unemployed people is that they're too busy doing leisure and they don't want to work. Right? Compared to other people who argue that part of the problem is the wage is very low. B, we don't think that it's true that the reason that people work more or less is because of the wage. Most people don't get to negotiate, I'll only work 3 hours, I'll only work 5 hours, right? For some jobs you do, but if you get a regular job, it's usually 40 hours a week with a clear contract, right? So I can't just tell the University of Washington, oh, I'll only teach 1 class. Oh, I'll only teach 5 classes, right? I am contractually obliged to follow through on a contract. So we want to start thinking about the way in which labor market contracts actually work. And whether or not this idea that you can choose on the margin an extra hour of work, an extra hour of work, an extra hour of work, really reflects ordinary everyday labor market. In fact, the people who end up on this extra hour of work are usually at the bottom tier of the labor market, doing contract labor hour by hour. And they're very often people who are not working less, they're often working more. They're often working 3 jobs, 2 jobs, because they're doing hour by hour, and they're trying to make their income and make a living wage. So one of the biggest controversies is going to be applying the rational economic idea, not just to labor markets, but particularly to the question of women's work, and particularly the way in which leisure stands in for a whole bunch of unpaid labor in the household.